Please welcome Chief Impact Officer, Andrew Zolli.
Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome to 4:30 Eastern Time, the peak learning hour of the day, as I'm sure you all know, and the easiest time slot, which is following Andrew Steer and Will Marshall talking about changing the world. So thanks to the programmers. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's so great to be here with all of you. I'm Andrew Zolli. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Planet. I lead a rock star team of people working on biodiversity and land use, conservation, all of these issues that we're going to talk about and have been talking about over these days. So I would like, and I have to tell you, I come at a point in the program where there are no more new announcements. We have no new break. I don't have to tell you about a new innovation that's coming from Planet, a new product, a new tool. Instead, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the things we just heard, and as we lean into a slightly different question, which is how do we actually take all of these breakthrough innovations, all of these tools, and actually convert them into real and lasting systems change, which is our collective exercise in this room. But before we do that, I want to mention a thing about, well, what we're here to do generally, and more generally, like what is the role of some of these new technologies? What do they mean for the way we see the world? So, you know, Planet makes tools of perception. That's what satellites are. That's what these instruments are. They're tools of noticing. They help humanity see change. That's so central to what we do. So I'd like to do a little exercise with you. And by the way, if anyone has played this game with me before, you're not allowed to play. This is just for newcomers, okay? We're just gonna do a little quick exercise on the screen here on noticing change. And I'm gonna tie it to AI and some of the things we heard about yesterday, especially in a minute. So I'm gonna show you two images on the screen. They're gonna flicker like this. Took me a long time to learn how to do that. And I promise you, there is one and only one difference between the two images. And when you see it, what I would like you to do is to gently and collaboratively, non-competitively, this is not about blocking the people behind you, raise your hand just so I can count you, okay? That's it. That's all we're gonna do is just notice this change. Okay, you ready? Everyone got the rules? 3, 2, 1, go. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm just going to try to get to 10. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. Now, honestly, how many people here saw no difference between those two images? Like, raise your hands. I'd like you to meet the honest cohort at Explorer 23. I don't know what those other people were looking at. You never ever mess with an Italian with a clicker. That's your first mistake. For those of you who didn't see it, and I want you to know the first time I was shown this, I didn't see it. I'd like you to pay attention to this part of the image. And I'd like you to watch as the thing that holds airplanes in the sky disappears in front of your eyeballs over and over and over again. This is alarming because many of you flew here. So why do we miss it? Well, there are lots of reasons, but let me just give you a couple. First of all, human beings are very good at looking for change where we expect it to occur. We generally suck at detecting change where we don't expect it to occur. So how many people here, just by show of hands, started by looking at the soldiers? Right? None of you coordinated, yet you all followed the same visual strategy. How many people here, first or second, looked at the tail of the airplane? A whole bunch of hands go up. That, by the way, makes you exactly like all other human beings because we're acutely interested in relationships. Who are these people, right? We expect the people and their affiliations to change. We don't expect the furniture to change. But the other thing that's true is that human beings are very good at detecting change that moves at roughly 1 meter per second. We generally suck, again, at detecting change that moves like this. And we're also really bad at detecting change that moves like this, in places where we don't expect it to occur, that's moving at a frequency that's outside of our normal experience. And one of the reasons I wanted to show you this was because, candidly, like we have an amazing moment that we're in, where we have produced extraordinary volumes of information about the Earth. And we are about to see the conjoining of those tools with these breakthrough new approaches in AI that help us sift and sort and make sense of and turn sensing into sense-making, all of that information. Now, there are enormous challenges with that, particularly with disinformation and making sure that we're actually not biasing and overtly overtraining algorithms to see the wrong things. But their opportunity to help us debias our cognition is incredibly important, especially right now. And that's because we're living through, well, a couple of us were just in Davos, and everybody was talking about this term, polycrisis. This is climate, COVID, conservation, conflict, and economic contraction. And that's just the C's, right? These huge, multidimensional, intersecting forces of change that introduce such profound levels of volatility to the environment that we're in, right? They make forecasting harder. They make navigation more important. They make resilience more important. They bring the kind of operational planning, the need for tighter and tighter feedback loops. They require that of us as never before. And this is an era of intersecting contractions. That is to say, the economic investment required to contend with COVID creates long-term economic challenges that make it harder to fight the kind of natural incentives to do nothing about things like climate change. So these forces interact with each other. And among the many things that we can think about is, what does this do to us? What does it do to our cognition to live in a world like this? Well, it's natural if you find yourself in a ditch, if you've driven off the road and you put a random group of strangers in a car and drive them off the road. Some people will want to push through to the other side, to a new place. And some people will say, it's time to back up and go backwards. Right? Both of them are sort of rational responses to finding yourself in a ditch. You're in a place where it's hard to go forward, and it can be very persuasive to want to go backwards. Psychologically, the cost of all of this complexity on our cognition is really profound. And I'll just mention one other thing, which is that if we did nothing else, right? If we actually found, amazingly, if we were able to find stasis about all of these challenges, they would still get more significant for us because the world is just becoming more fully populated by the day. This is what we call the expanding bullseye effect. If you have disasters that are consistent in their frequency and their severity, like a flood or an earthquake, but you just grow the number of people who are on the earth, you're going to affect more people with each one of those disasters. So we don't have to do anything to see a world in which that stuff is going to become more significant. And that has real consequences for us. Psychologically, when we detect threats like that, it's natural to want us to do this, to self-segregate, to say, I'm sorry, that's a really tough problem, but there's nothing I can do about it. Or, I'm sorry, I have to step into my own space. I can't deal with you, right? Or, hey, this is a problem, and there are going to be winners and losers. I had better be a winner, because the cost of being a loser is going to be very, very high. And it focuses on the present in a way that can make us blind to long-term future challenges or instill a sense of helplessness. And we see that in societies today. We see that in institutions today, a kind of retrenchment back, right? A desire to go back. But those problems all require extraordinary levels of cooperation. They require us, if we're going to do anything about them, to do it together. There will be no singular winners in a world with that level of conflict and challenge. We have to drive to a great transition that's driven by collaboration and self-desegregation. We have to take ourselves out of isolation, put ourselves into structures of community with new kinds of accountability and non-zero-sum thinking where I win and you win. Maybe not to the same degree. We still want competition, but we need to create structures that are more than zero-sum. So how do we do that? I want to tell you that I don't have all the answers to those questions, but we've invited a couple of really amazing people into the conversation today. We're going to meet in a few minutes, Enric Sala and Christiana Figueres. We're going to talk about some of that in a few minutes, but I wanted to give you a couple of things that we've been thinking about as we lean into how do we drive systems change? How do we create this kind of transitional change? So I want to, we could do hours and hours and hours on this subject. I just want to give you 4 ideas. The first one is about the primacy of trust, the absolute essential ingredient for our collective action is having trust in each other, institutional trust. Yesterday you heard Brad Smith say, we've got to do things to defend democracy. Well, one of the first things we have to do is have a democracy that's worth defending, right? And that means we have to have trust in institutions. And interestingly, there's a fantastic institution called Edelman. They do this big survey, this big global trust survey every year. And they found this really interesting thing, which is that the quality of information across all sectors, business, NGOs, governments, and media, information quality is the biggest builder of trust. So if we don't have trustworthy information, right, in an era of disinformation, of weaponized disinformation and all the other things, that's the building blocks on which our institutional trust is formed. Now, it's not just about having trust, it's also about having trustworthy messages from trustworthy messengers. This guy over here is Dr. Greg Brickner, and his colleague, who I don't have a photograph here, is Marty. Are you here, Phil Marty? Let's see if he's around, from Organic Valley. These guys are amazing. Okay, I have to tell you this really great story. We were doing this work on sustainable agriculture, listing all of the various use cases associated with delivering sustainable agricultural outcomes. And one of the things our team listed was the use of remote sensing to help guide herds of cattle. You can tell I'm a rancher. Herds of cattle around their pastures to optimize their use of the pasture land, right? And I didn't believe that anyone was doing this, and I actually looked up, and there was like a little notice about it online, these guys, and I didn't even know they were customers of Planet, and I wrote them an incredibly naive email. Excuse me, I'm from Planet, and I've heard you're using satellite imagery to move cows around on the Earth, and I think it's fascinating. Would you tell me about it? And they said, oh, we're using Planet imagery to do that. It's really amazing. What he's holding up is a pasture management plan for this particular organic farm in Wisconsin, where those cows are actually moved around the field using satellite imagery to optimize their organic grazing practices so they can produce that milk, which you can see in the third thing, which is my local milk. That is the cow that produces the milk that I pour on my family's Cheerios every morning. That is the other end of the bovine supply chain, the milk supply chain for me. And it goes to space. It's amazing. These guys produce these assets, these information assets, and they work with hundreds of farmers and farms all over the country to encourage this organic practice. And the reason it works is because he's a farmer. He's not some Silicon Valley landed the UFO in your pasture land, I have the solution. He's someone who's actually managed a farm, and he understands. This idea is so essential, and it's so important to the work that you do. And it's the reason why ultimately we can't win without you, because all the great technology that we're producing is essentially useless if it is not translated. And that translational leadership is the work that happens in this room. Okay, second thing I want to tell you about is about measurement as fast as change. And I'm going to steal a wonderful metaphor from Will, who likes to say that when you're building a satellite, you have to measure the forces acting on the satellite as fast as those forces of change are acting on the satellite. Otherwise, there's a risk that the instrument could spin out of control. And if you're only measuring it every 10 minutes or so, it could have plummeted by the time that you actually are finding out what's going on. You'll never correct it. Well, we live on a satellite. It just happens to have 8 billion astronauts, some of them who are here in this room, right? And we are collectively trying to manage change. And we have to manage change as fast as it's unfolding. And my favorite example, we didn't quite get to this on the main stage yesterday, is this work that's happening in Brazil. This amazing work where, with our partners, SECON, we're deploying this satellite imagery that allows for the federal police to actually see acts of deforestation as they're happening and unfolding, and then to deploy the scarce resource of their agents and interdiction efforts. They've planned and operated now more than 120 joint operations with thousands of agents, but most importantly, they've collected nearly $2 billion. There's so much economic opportunity in the collection and the correction of those activities. There's a sort of very deep joint win that happens there. You can't do that unless you're measuring the change as fast as the change is occurring. Now, the third thing is you have to have pathways and incentives for scale. You basically have to be able to enable people to win at systems change. So we're seeing that happen a ton in our work in forests and land use. And I'll just share with you what we see happening all the time here. One is you're starting to see these signals that come from government, the REDD+ system that the UN operates that encourages payments for performance for avoided deforestation, or the core of the Paris Agreement. And that policy decision drives the opportunity for measurement, because now we have a reason to measure the change we want to incentivize. So we create the incentives that drives the measurement, and that in turn creates all of this opportunity for partners like some of you who are in this room. Some of these organizations are here today who are creating thriving economic opportunities around the creation of this new economic opportunity, and that builds confidence. That's the thing that is trust and confidence. It turns out to be the fuel of systems change, because if we can do it successfully there, then we can do it like we're doing with our friends at the Nature Conservancy, measuring all the blue carbon, all the coastal blue carbon. Well, just like we're building carbon credits for terrestrial ecosystems like forests, I'm certain one day soon we will start to see them for coastal blue carbon assets as well. And we're starting to see these new policy regimes that emerge for things like deforestation-free supply chains. I woke up this morning in my hotel room to this piece of news. This I thought was really interesting. This is a piece from the Times about a supermarket in the UK who's raising chickens in the UK, but with feed that's linked to deforestation in the Amazon. So when you look at the chicken that's on the counter, you can see the effect, right? This era of radical supply chain transparency will be here before we know it. But it is built on a history of successful experimentation and policy architecture and measurement and entrepreneurial activity and capacity development, which leads to the next round and the next round. I really want to tell you, everyone, I think we're like right, the tipping point moments for big systems change like this, like in global supply chains, it is about to hit us. The wave has not, the tsunami has not washed over. We are ahead of it, but just. The last thing I just want to tell you, say to you is that, you know, no one gets here alone. The way that this work happens, if you want deeply committed systems change, is it happens in tribes. It happens in the deep tribe. There are millions and billions of people who are aware of climate change. This is a very small portion of people who can do anything about it. And a significant portion of that population is in this room. That's amazing, right? We keep our spirits up. We tolerate our occasional failures. We understand them as necessary, right? We amplify and support each other on the way to this bigger transition. And the best example, best thing I could say about that is a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, Francisco Varela. It says, when a living system is suffering from ill health and the polycrisis is a crisis of planetary health. The remedy is found in connecting it more deeply with itself. And in many ways, the way I think of all of you is you are the tendrils by which the planet is being reconnected. The things that were externalities and avoided and ignored begin to be brought into the systems that actually govern human experience. And in that sense, it's been an amazing chance just to listen to all of you over the last couple of days, hear what you're actually doing, hear what's coming, has been enormously inspiring for us at Planet. Not just excited to share with you all the cool things that we're doing. Okay, so that's me. Now, I am very excited to welcome two extraordinary people up to the stage. The first one is Enric Sala. Enric, do you want to come join us? This is Enric Sala, National Geographic Explorer in Residence. Thank you.
Where's the other chair?
And hopefully, we can see her down here, and I'm hoping momentarily you'll be able to see her up there. Is Christiana Figueres. Christiana was the head of the UNFCCC, the UN Convention on Climate Change, and is, I can't say, as responsible as anyone in the world, more responsible than anyone in the world for the creation of the Paris Climate Agreement.
I have to correct you on that one, Em.
Oh.
It's the committed tribe that is responsible.
God bless you. I'm going to pay you $5 in Bitcoin later.
Okay.
Well, let me just say a word or two about each of these people, and I'm so keen to hear your perspective. But you know, Christiana, the Paris Climate Agreement, an incredibly successful, obviously enormously important galvanizing structure against which we do all of this work, and a pioneering leader in climate change, not just up into and including the Paris Climate Agreement, but all of this work to kind of foster the global climate community, and to encourage optimism, a kind of reasoned optimism about where we can go. And Enric, Explorer in Residence at the National Geographic Society, leads Pristine Seas, the Pristine Seas movement. So I'm going to ask you a little bit, each of you, about how we take these new tools and how we actually build them into negotiation structures, or how do we use them to actually drive systems change. But let me say a word or two about Enric, the vastly more handsome side of this panel. The first thing I think is important is that Pristine Seas has now created 26, I think, of the most successful marine protected areas. It's an aggregate area, I think you were telling me, that is 2/3 the size of the United States. So this effort has actually conserved an area 2/3 of the size of the country on Earth. That is an extraordinary accomplishment. So, Enric, I want to start with you.
Haven't. Those visionary countries have.
Yes, yeah, I absolutely get that, right? Not you personally. But I want to ask you a little bit about, and this is going to be a question I want to ask to both of you, about how we negotiate this complex transition. You know, I think about, like, when you're looking at a new marine protected area, for instance, you're talking about something where presumably there are people who are for it, and there are probably some very strongly invested interests who are against it. What's the strategy, what's the technique that you use for negotiating these kinds of challenges?
Yes, well, you can have all the information in the world,
Yeah.
and that alone is not going to solve the problem, right? As Andrew Steer was saying before, you need engagement. The way we look at it, okay, there is an area of the ocean that is very important for biodiversity, for fisheries, for climate change mitigation, and the government is responsible for protecting that place. But key stakeholders have to be in favor. So the first thing we do is to look at, okay, who's going to oppose and who's going to support?
Right.
And there are people who are going to support actively, right? The conservation organizations, and that they are a great partner. You just need to keep them engaged. There are groups who are going to support passively. Some people will say, yes, this is a great idea, but I'm not going to campaign for this because I don't know enough. This is where education and awareness has a role. But then on the other side of the fence, there are people who oppose, who we can bring to the side of the fence with the right incentives. These are, for example, coastal, artisanal, small-scale fishermen who understand that their fishing catches have been declining over time, and that they need a solution, but they kind of don't trust this conservation thing, right? So with the right economic incentives to help with the transition to a protected area, then we bring them to the side. But then there is this group, and Christiana will have examples of this. There are the active opponents, and it's impossible to bring them to the other side of the fence. They have, their interest is for short-term economic profit by depleting nature, and they don't care about long-term, really, as much as they talk about sustainability. So what do we do with them? Well, there are two options. One is to unveil the impact of their activities, basically naming and shaming. And the other one is coercion, right? The government has to act if they are doing something wrong. And if I can give you one example, so this is not abstract. In 2017, the Mexican government wanted to create the largest fully protected and no-take area around some islands of the Pacific coast, the Revillagigedo Islands. So this park was going to be 150,000 square kilometers, the size of Belgium. And of course, the tuna fishing industry opposed. And they said, if you close this area, we're going to lose 20% of our tuna catch. This is going to increase the price of the can of tuna. This is going to destroy the economy of Mexico. And we looked at satellite data from Global Fishing Watch. And we were able to measure that they spend only 3% of their time there. And we asked the industry for data, and they said, no, they are confidential. Right? Yeah. And we were able to show the government this transparent data. We were talking about transparency before, from satellite tracking of the ships. And with that information helped to convince the Mexican government that protecting that place was not going to harm the fishing industry, was not going to harm the catch of 2 or 3 species of fish, and actually was going to improve the preservation of thousands of other species. So in this case, the right type of data at the right moment, with the right messenger, with a very clear specific goal and a timeline, that worked very well.
We do a lot of work with Global Fishing Watch, and we have seen this story play out time and again, this idea that transparency, that responsibly enabling a transparent planet, drives this new frameworks of accountability. It is important that it's a shared transparency with the right actors so that everyone has a common sense of truth. And we're seeing this now. I think a lot of organizations are not ready to live in a much more transparent world. But let me turn it to Christiana. Christiana, I'd love to ask you the same kind of questions. I'm curious about the work. Where did you find the hardest sticking points as you were engaging in the global campaign for the Paris Agreement? And more generally, maybe how are we doing now as we heard, well on our way to the 2030 milestone? I'm just kind of curious about your perspective on negotiating these big agreements.
Well, first of all, hola, Enric, good to see you. And thanks for bringing us together, Andrew. So as Enric has said, on any issue, people, institutions, countries, organizations spread themselves across a gamut from enthusiastic support to obstinate troublemaking and everywhere in between. And so you have to decide what strategy are you going to use to move forward. Now, sometimes you can leave the obstinate obstructionist out, or use coercive measures, as Enric has mentioned. But sometimes even that doesn't work. Because in the case of a multilateral agreement, such as the Paris Agreement, we knew that we actually needed unanimity. So to get unanimity, you need every single country, even coal-producing countries, even oil and gas-producing countries, had to be on board. And the only way to get them on board is actually to reinterpret your zero sum, Andrew. You said we have to sort of leave zero sum aside and move to something different. I would suggest that maybe there's a different way of looking at that and say, why don't we reframe zero sum? And why don't we understand that as we are reaching and overreaching, passing on over the boundaries of our planet, already surpassing those planetary boundaries, maybe we need a new zero sum concept that we all act from, which is either we're all losers if we continue to surpass planetary boundaries, or we can all be winners. That is a very different interpretation of zero sum. Zero sum, the two words, still there, but reinterpreted and reframed very differently. And in my experience, that's the only way forward, certainly with climate. And I would actually argue to a great extent also with biodiversity, because we're never going to be able to have enough coercion or enough incentives or money to bring people on board. And it can get us to a certain extent. But when we all actually understand that we are all bound by our common humanity living on this common home, if you truly understand that for the depth of the implications of that truth, then you begin to develop the ability to jump over the divisions that are keeping us apart. And that is what Varela, in your last quote, was talking about. The more complicated, the more you have to look at this, at the system itself. Because the system, in our case, the planetary system, the human system, the societal system, we have the ability to heal ourselves. We have the ability to solve these problems. So it is about looking inside and touching our common humanity and touching the common humanity in those that we have perhaps at first thought of as our enemies or obstacles. Not easy, but I would argue critical to do.
Christiana, let me ask you a follow-up, and I would ask you to come in a moment, Enric, about sort of whole person leadership in that sense. You know, I think about, we've followed your work very closely, both of you, for a long time, and at Planet. And the thing that's so interesting is how, like your passions, the inner person comes out in your work. And I know that I've heard you speak before, Christiana, about just active listening to the other, engagement with the other. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that human side plays into these kind of, what can sometimes feel kind of like sterile policy kinds of decisions and sterile technological decisions, if you follow what I mean. Just how do we show up, and like, what have you learned from a leadership perspective there? And I might then ask you, Enric, to address that.
Well, obviously leadership is not positional. That's that. Anyway, we don't even have to talk about that. Leadership actually really is completely distributed, and everyone has not only the potential, but the responsibility to be a leader in whatever the sphere of influence is that you are standing in. So I think leadership is basically the courage and the commitment to see the world from everyone else's shoes and everyone else's perspective. It's not about imposing your view or your opinion on others, but rather to truly be able to take off your shoes, stand in the shoes of someone else, and see the view from their perspective. That is extraordinarily educational and gives us a kaleidoscopic view of the complex realities that we're in, so that we abandon our own judgments, our own opinions that tend to cast a blaming finger on others, and really begin to understand that every single human being, every decision to begin with is a human decision. And every human is making decisions out of the context that they are living and within the perceptions that they're having of that context in that moment. So there's always a reason why people are taking decisions or expressing their opinions. And if you understand that context, and if you are able through questioning and listening, not through stating and blaming, but through questioning and listening, to expand the boundaries of that context in the conversation with someone else, you will very quickly reach the sphere in which there is common ground. It's actually not that difficult to do because we are all humans. We tend to forget that simple and powerful truth.
Enric, can I ask you to expand on that?
It's impossible to expand.
Yeah, I know.
Like Christiana says. She's like Socrates.
Yeah, I know.
But no, Christiana, you are absolutely right that to put yourselves in someone else's shoes, you have to take yours first off, right? And we are all humans, and one of the problems of being human is that we are 8 billion centers of the universe, right? So you can have all the empathy in the world, but in my experience, it's not so easy to have someone change their beliefs, right? And that common ground, translating the common ground into action is something that Christiana did masterfully, miraculously, during the climate change, the Paris Agreement negotiations. You still have to write the book with the secret sauce, because that will be a secret for great education for everybody. But I think that there is some behavioral economic research now showing that your perception of the world is not objective, that our ideology, or the context in which we are raised, if you are raised in a family that watches Fox News versus a family that watches PBS, probably your ideologies are going to be quite different. And the ideology mediates, conditions the way you see the world, right? So this putting yourself in somebody else's shoes is absolutely necessary for that leadership that Christiana was mentioning. But there is an asymmetry, because there is always one side that is less empathic than the other, right? So it takes a lot of psychology to be able to do this type of work. It's not all information, it's not all policy. It takes a lot of psychology and understanding of the human behavior and human psyche to be able to get the results that Christiana was able to achieve.
Well, Enric,
Be that as it may, Andrew, may I have your permission to switch slightly to ask both of you a question? Because it seems to me that Planet is working on two of my pet peeves on why we have had so many barriers to both climate action as well as biodiversity protection. And one of my first pet peeves that I have now let go of is the lack of visibility around greenhouse gases. I remember as I was preparing the Paris Agreement, I really wanted to get out there with a magical phosphorescent paintbrush and paint every molecule of CO2 and of every other gas. Because I thought if we could see them, if everybody could see these molecules, we would have a very, very different decision here. So the fact that you're making that visible is so helpful, Andrew, and would love Enric's also sense of the power of visibility, because it's not just data. It's not reading, X number of gigatons or X percent of something. No, data is fine, but it's just not enough. But the visibility of how that data is actually being expressed day by day, I think is so powerful. So that was my first peeve. So thank you very much for allowing me to let go of my first peeve.
You're welcome.
My second peeve that you're also allowing me to let go of is the power of storytelling. The power of storytelling. I just think that we take way too many static views
of our reality, and we are not having a dynamic view, which is the storytelling. Once upon a time, here's where we were. Now we're here, and in the future, we can be there. We have not developed our incredible storytelling capacity, in particular, storytelling about positive changes taking place.
That's where we're going.
The fact that exactly, so the fact that now with your 200 satellites, yes, you can monitor the destruction that we're doing, and that's important, but also, and also, because I don't believe in a but world, I believe in an and also world, and also the fact that you can monitor for Enric's purposes, for example, the regrowth of coral or the replanting and reforestation of land, regeneration of land. That to me is so exciting, Andrew, because I just don't believe that blaming people and doom and gloom stories are inspiring at all. I don't know one person who's inspired by doom and gloom. I know many people who are paralyzed by doom and gloom, but no one who's inspired. Yet I know many people who are inspired by changes that are not just in the future, maybe perhaps possible, but that are already occurring and that begin to seed our imagination of what further changes we can make. So for both of those, I want to thank you for letting me go of my pet peeves, and would love both you and Enric to speak to the power of visibility and storytelling, positive storytelling.
Okay, I'll go first. Thank you for that. That was actually the question on stories. A perfect setup, as it was one I was going to ask you about, both of you about. So just a couple of thoughts. The first thing is that when I think about what we're building at Planet, all of the different technologies, all the different tools, I think of them as a kind of moral mirror that we hold up to humanity. And what we see in that mirror is relationships. We see the relationship of the change in our daily lives. But if we look further, we see the changes in other places and other people's lives and the way they're correlated with changes in our lives. That is to say, they are a change of relationship. And if Planet has a kind of technological superpower. We can look at change all over the world every day. And if you look at change every day, there's some really interesting things that happen. And one of the most important ones is that the subject-object distinction starts to dissolve a little bit. The ego starts to dissolve. The sense of separateness starts to dissolve. The sense that I'm over here and that's over there. It becomes we are over here. That is to say, the moment enlarges and the point enlarges. That is to say, the point in space is less interesting than some larger point in space. The moment in the instant is less important than this larger shift as you move from the photograph to the film strip, as you move from seeing things in stasis to things changing in relationship. It is profoundly altering of your perception of your relationships when you then cease looking at those images and you start looking around the rest of the world, like all the ways in which we're related to all the systems that are making this moment in this ballroom, in this hotel, possible. And the last thing I'll just say about that is that it's important that that film strip is not just a film strip of doom, that it is not a one-way story to our collective annihilation, but that it reveals actually a much more complex world that we live in, a world with upsides and downsides and sideways and all of these other kinds of things that are happening, that the world also that is revealed to these instruments when you look at them every day is more complicated than your understanding. And in the gap between what you thought you understood and what you actually see is the space for hope, is the space for opportunity. That's an incredible space. I don't know how we turn that into stories just yet, but I can tell you that that's how I live that experience. Enric.
Shouldn't we finish? This was beautiful. Shouldn't we finish there?
I guess we're also out of time, but because they're flashing the links at me. But I do want to say thank you, and Christiana, thank you for your time. Enric, thank you for your time. We are obviously on a journey together through all of these all of these things. And it's been great to spend time with the two of you this afternoon. So thank you very, very much, everybody. And
Thank you very much.
all right. Thank you.